The story begins with a pretty woman bringing her lunchbox home. When she gets inside, she empties most of the food from the lunchbox, except for the last bit, which is orange, and eats that part. This woman's name is May, and even though she looks like she's in her late 30s, people call her Aunt May. Later, a seemingly wealthy woman named Mrs. Lee comes to May's door and goes into her house. Mrs. Lee used to be an actress when she was young, but she lost her fame as she grew older and her looks faded. She doesn't want to lose her looks because getting older might harm her marriage. Aunt May's dumplings are known for making people look younger and preventing aging. Mrs. Lee confides in Aunt May about her concern, and Aunt May decides to prepare some special dumplings for her. While making the dumplings, she also mentions that she used to be a big fan of Mrs. Lee when she was on TV. When Mrs. Lee tastes the dumplings, she quickly spits them out, but May explains to her that she needs to sacrifice taste for long-term benefits. She tells her that she loves to eat them and also sings an old song to make Mrs. Lee happy. So, Mrs. Lee ends up eating all the dumplings. Mr. Lee, a wealthy businessman, is swimming with some young girls. Then he begins receiving a massage from a masseuse. He informs her that he's staying in the hotel because his house is being renovated. He eats some egg birds during the massage, to which the masseuse reacts disgustingly. He flirts with her and touches her inappropriately during the massage. Mrs. Lee watches this from the window of her hotel room above and becomes even more concerned about her marriage. Meanwhile, Aunt May visits a hospital, where a doctor hands her a lunchbox and mentions that it was quite challenging to bring it there, due to increased surveillance. The doctor then inquires about a person named Wang Soyi, and Aunt May informs her that they had broken up because he opposed the one-child policy and disagreed with her multiple abortions. He feared it would result in a cursed child, as a karma for her abortions, leading to their breakup. Aunt May gets her lunchbox checked while leaving by security and tells them that it just contains lunch for her kid. Mrs. Lee later meets with Aunt May and expresses her desire for quicker results. Aunt May responds that she will need some high-potency ingredients for faster effects, and she is trying to find it. She talks to someone on the phone and asks if he is dating, and also about his school results. At the end of the phone call, she compliments him on choosing her as his sponsor. Aunt May inquires if he is her son, to which Mrs. Lee reveals that they can have children, and she doesn't know whose fault it is. Mrs. Lee then asks Aunt May about the secret recipe for her dumplings, and Aunt May discloses that it involves using the meat of unborn fetuses. The best ones are in their 5th or 6th month, encased in a water sack and covered by a creamy fatty layer. They tend to have more distinct colors and their cranium is also unique. Mrs. Lee is doubtful and attempts to hear the sounds from the kitchen where Aunt May is making dumplings. Suddenly, Aunt May appears and offers her a piece of meat from an unborn fetus. Mrs. Lee is frightened but still eats the dumplings because she is determined to regain her youth and beauty at any cost. In the meantime, Mr. Lee becomes intimate with the masseuse in his hotel room. When Mrs. Lee calls and inquires about his whereabouts, he states that he's in a business meeting. She reminds him of a promise, and he assures her that he'll be there for their 15th anniversary. Mrs. Lee feels somewhat relaxed after hearing this. However, later, Mr. Lee informs Mrs. Lee that he won't be able to join her on their 15th anniversary due to another meeting he needs to attend, which will last only a few days. He writes a substantial check for Mrs. Lee and asks her why money doesn't make her happy, and she explains that it's his absence that makes her worry, and she needs his company. Mr. Lee leaves after saying that he'll soon be back. Mrs. Lee pays another visit to Aunt May, expressing her ongoing concern about her loose skin and inquiring when she will see more potent results. Aunt May assures her that she will get a solution soon. After Mrs. Lee leaves, a woman arrives, a friend of Mrs. Kam, who had mentioned Aunt May's past as a renowned doctor in China. This woman is accompanied by her daughter, Kat. She tells Aunt May that her father raped her, and she is so young and can't carry that fetus. Aunt May refuses, saying that this is illegal and risky. She should go to a good hospital or get it done through the black market. Kat's mother explains that she lacks the financial means to cover the fees, and with tears in her eyes, she pleads for Aunt May's help, emphasizing her desperate need to do something for her daughter, otherwise it can kill her. At the same time, Mrs. Lee observes masseuse heading to the hotel room with Mr. Lee. Masseuse hangs a do not disturb sign outside the door, intensifying Mrs. Lee's anxiety. In response to her unease, Mrs. Lee invites Aunt May to her house. While she acknowledges the grandeur of her home, she expresses that it doesn't feel like a real home because it is empty. She then shares the story of how she met Mr. Lee. Mrs. Lee began her career by securing a job at a TV station, right after high school. She quickly rose to stardom, and Mr. Lee served as the sponsor for her show. During one of her performances, she had a fall, and Mr. Lee came to her rescue by catching her. They fell in love with each other. At that time, she was just 20 years old, while he was in his late 30s. She says that Mr. Lee still loves her. He just wants the body of a 20-year-old. She then inquires about Aunt May's life, and Aunt May explains that she broke up with her first love, so she married a cook. However, she had always dreamt of moving to Hong Kong, as it was a common aspiration for many young people at that time, and this dream motivated her to get a divorce. Aunt May playfully teases Mrs. Lee, suggesting that Mr. Lee would never consider such a choice. Aunt May returns and proceeds with Kat's abortion and preserves the unborn fetus in the refrigerator. She also advises her mother to be careful in the future. She later calls Mrs. Lee for dumplings. While preparing the dumplings, Mrs. Lee looks into the kitchen and is deeply shocked to find a 5-month-old unborn fetus. Mrs. Lee, initially horrified by what she saw, attempts to run away. However, her insatiable greed and desire to regain her youth quickly overpower her, compelling her to return and consume the dumplings. Soon after, Mrs. Lee receives a call informing her that Mr. Lee has broken his leg. She rushes to the hospital and taunts him, remarking that he finally needs her. Mr. Lee apologizes for his mistakes and they get intimate. Meanwhile, on a bus, Kat begins to profusely bleed from her private part. As her mother exits the bus, Kat collapses on the floor and passes away. Her mother blames herself for the tragedy. With the consumption of the special dumplings, Mrs. Lee finally begins to feel young again. She calls her friends to celebrate her newfound youth and vitality. During dinner, her friends secretly discuss what has caused Mrs. Lee to look so young. When Mrs. Lee joins them at the table, they start to complain about a foul smell and begin searching for the source. Mrs. Lee realizes the odor is coming from her, so she excuses herself to take a bath. Concerned and confused, she calls Aunt May to ask what she has fed her that's making her smell so bad. Aunt May told Mrs. Lee, "Just relax. That funny smell, it means it is working." Mrs. Lee got angry and threatened to sue her if anything bad happened. In the other room, Mr. Lee was shocked while overhearing their conversation. While on the call, Aunt May enthusiastically mentions that Channel 2 is re-airing her TV series. Mrs. Lee, while watching the show and thinking about her younger days, becomes emotional and starts to cry. Days had passed, and Mrs. Lee went to the doctor. She discovered that she wasn't actually sick and also noticed that her skin was getting smoother. Meanwhile, Mr. Lee pays a visit to Aunt May and accuses her of running an illegal business. Aunt May insists that it's just a dumpling shop, but Mr. Lee suggests that she's promoting cannibalism. Curiously, he then inquires about whether it genuinely works. Aunt May then tells him the story of cannibalism. She tells him that it was something common in history, especially in China, where neighbors treated each other as children to eat and human organs were also used in many medicines. It was not considered morally wrong. It was impossible to survive famines and wars without eating human flesh. Warriors drank their enemies' blood as an act of celebration. She starts seducing Mr. Lee, and they both get intimate. Mr. Lee takes note of Aunt May's true age in a picture, but she emphasizes that it's the condition of her body that matters, and he could also maintain youth by consuming her dumplings. A sudden call interrupts them, with Mrs. Lee demanding more supplies as Mrs. Lee realizes that she cannot stay young without eating May's dumplings. However, Aunt May does not respond and hangs up on her. Mr. Lee departs, and Aunt May tells him to return soon. As he leaves, Mrs. Lee arrives, but Aunt May does not open the door for her. Meanwhile, Kat's mother murders her father and takes revenge on her daughter. Later, Mrs. Lee discovers that the masseuse is pregnant with Mr. Lee's child. She panics and begins to cry. Mrs. Lee returns to Aunt May, apologizes for her previous behavior, and offers her money for assistance. However, Aunt May replies that she is retired and unwilling to help. In a desperate situation, Mrs. Lee approaches the masseuse and discovers that she is 5 months into her pregnancy. She comes to the realization that Mr. Lee had made an agreement with the masseuse to have a son and was providing financial support for this arrangement. Mrs. Lee persuades the masseuse to consider giving her the fetus instead, by offering to pay a higher amount than Mr. Lee. Later, when she goes to the doctor, she asks not to use any drugs and wants the fetus to be alive and in pure form. She asks for prostaglandins to help with contractions. In the end, it's revealed that she uses the unborn baby to make dumplings. Did you find the story enjoyable? In your opinion, which part of the story do you find unacceptable, the part involving the raping of a father to his daughter? Or the part about consuming a fetus? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. Additionally, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, as your support means a lot to us. See you in the next video.